Well, hi everyone, and hello to people at home. This is so strange doing it a second time. Sorry guys, you have to listen to it again. Okay, so my name's Chris, and for those that don't know me all that well, I'm part of the group of people that emigrated over from Bathgate once our church started wound up. I've been a Christian since I was 16. I'm 30 now, and I've actually been coming to St. John's for a long time. I was coming here when our sort of church was still going because we were an evening church. I used to come here in the morning because it was a place where I could be anonymous, I didn't have any responsibilities, and I could just sit in the teaching and be fed. And yes, that does make me sound like a parasite, but here I am trying to give something back. I was supposed to join membership in March 2020, but I don't know if you remember this, but something came up, and it got pushed back a wee bit. So, here I am, and here's me trying to contribute somehow. So when Andy Clark asked me, do you want to do a series with me on Nehemiah? I was like, do you want to help me with it? I was like, yeah, absolutely, that sounds great. He's like, great, how do you want to do it? And I'm like, what do you mean? You asked me to help you with it. And he's like, yeah, but I want you to make it your own. So he said, you've got 3 weeks to tell this story, and I'll do one of them. And I'm like, oh, thanks, mate. So I decided, so I really, really love movies. I can go on about them for ages. Ask me for some recommendations. And I was like, okay, well, if we've got 3 weeks to tell one story, why don't we do it like a 3-act structure? That's how a lot of movies are constructed these days. That's how they tell a story. So you've got Act 1, which is called the setup. That's where we learn the context, who our characters are, the world they inhabit, and what the rules are, if you like. What are the background stuff. And then we have Act 2, which is what's called the conflict. That's the mountain they climb, the journey they go on, be it literal or emotional. It's the battle they fight. And then you've got Act 3, and that's called the resolution. That's the sort of last 20 minutes of a film, and that's where you get the climax of the film. You get all the plots being tied up. You've got the nice happy ending, and you've got the lesson you were supposed to learn. Cool. So, with that in mind, see, this is a first for me because I've never done a sermon series before. I preach on a fairly regular basis elsewhere, but I get to just do one sermon and then run off. I like to just take what was said, who said it, who did they say it to, where did they say it, when did they say it, and what's the cultural context behind it, and then just sort of distill 3 points, 3 lessons for you to take away. But I can't really do it this time. See, I don't have 3 points to give you this week. I'm sure Andy will have 3 immaculate points to give you next week. And in the last week, there are some things I really do want to say about Nehemiah, and the well and depth of the wisdom that's in this book. For me, going from not understanding when we're reading this to this book is necessary. This is so necessary to read. But in order to do that and do that well, I have to do the first part, which is us setting up. This is the groundwork. So I'm afraid there's a lot of backstory here, and I need you to just sort of stick with it, and I promise you this is going somewhere. So, instead of asking the question, what am I supposed to learn today? My recommendation is instead, try asking the question, if you were the people or the leaders in this story, what would you be thinking and what would you be feeling at the time? Just learning the context, and keep in mind, they would have known the context very, very well themselves. Also, I can't tell if what I'm saying is landing or if it's bombing. So if I'm doing well, can you just give me, when I look up at you, just give me a thumbs up when I ask. And if I'm not doing well, just use, thank you, Beth. And Beth was just showing me her favorite finger. And if that's, and if I'm not doing so well, just give me a thumbs up with your other hand. Okay? I'll keep track, it's fine. Okay, so Nehemiah. So some of you will know that before Nehemiah comes the book of Ezra. And some of you may know that Ezra and Nehemiah are not 2 books, they're one. In the Hebrew Bible, they are 1 book, and in your Bibles, they would have been 1 book until about 1100 AD. They got split up sometime in the medieval era. I'm not sure quite why, but they're 2. But when you read through them, you see they are actually the same, because the narrative of the 3 characters is the same in each time. It's the same structure. So they're one story. It's the story of Zerubbabel to start with, which means planted in Israel, and his sort of journey to rebuilding the temple. Ezra, who is a teacher of the law, who starts sort of rebuilding more of the religious institution, if you like. And then we've got Nehemiah, who wants to rebuild the wall. Okay? So we are focusing on Nehemiah's story, but to understand it, we need to understand something of the book of Ezra. Okay? So, just to start with the book of Ezra. One sec. Yep. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, this is Ezra 1. In the first year of King Cyrus, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. Okay, so to understand Ezra, we need to look at the book of Jeremiah. Sorry, we're going down a rabbit hole. I do apologize. Okay, so where do we find ourselves in the biblical narrative? Okay, so we're in the time of exile. So to give some context, in the book of Jeremiah, one of the prophets, Israel's lost its way. There is a rampant social injustice. They've more or less abandoned the calling that God gave them as a nation, and they're even engaging in worshipping other gods, including Molech, which, for those that know, that's a horrifying practice that goes with that. God isn't happy and decides he's going to discipline them, and so he's going to use the Babylonian Empire to conquer them and scatter them and exile them from their land for a period of 70 years. I should also say that Jeremiah prophesied that Babylon themselves would be conquered for their injustice and pride, but he was going to use them to discipline Israel. Jeremiah is a heavy book. It's not light reading, but right in the middle we get this little reprieve. You see, along with God's promises of judgment, there's also this promise of hope. So I'm just going to read Jeremiah 29, 10 to 14. Okay. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me. When you seek me with all your heart, I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. So God promises to return. Even though he's going to scatter them, he gives them this promise, I am going to bring you back. But that's not the only kind of prophecy that surrounds the exile. There's a couple of others. I'm not going to read them all out. There's one or two I'm going to read, but I'm just going to mention a couple of them, okay? I've got my notes here if anyone's interested in seeing these themselves. So, Isaiah 11, a prophet that lived around about the same time, it talks about the Lord gathering up the exiles and a messianic figure coming, a shoot from the stump of Jesse. Isaiah 43, 14 to 12, talks about the exile, bringing down Babylon, and God making a way out of the exile, but using some interesting language to compare it to the Exodus story. Isaiah 48, 20 to 21, you see this same comparison to Exodus. I'm just going to read that for you. Leave Babylon, flee from Babylon, announces this with shouts of joy, and proclaim it, send it out to the ends of the earth. Say, the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob. They did not thirst when he led them through the deserts. He made water flow for them from a rock. He split the rock, and water gushed out. That's the water from a stone thing. Zechariah 2, now these are prophetic words that happened during the exile. Zechariah 2 talks of the city of Jerusalem filled with a great number of people in it and God's glory within. Zechariah 8 talks about God saving his people from other countries and bringing them back to Jerusalem, and speaks of God's kingdom coming over all the nations and all people from all nations taking hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe because God is with him. Ezekiel 40 to 48, a lot of detail about this new temple being built and God's glory returning to it. Ezekiel 36, 24 to 27, we see again God is bringing his people back, he's cleaning them, and he's giving them a new heart. I'm just going to read that for you. For I will take you out of the nations, I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I will sprinkle you with clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. And again, this is something we find in Jeremiah 31 as well. He made a mention of a new heart and the law being written on it. So, to summarize these this package of prophetic promises proclaimed by prophets passed down to these punished people by patriarchs on the path home to their previously promised pastures. I just made that up. In other words, to summarize the prophetic package we've got, okay? The people will return, and the return will be similar to the Exodus from Egypt. The people will rebuild the temple and the city. All the nations will come to worship God, and a messianic king will appear, and God's people will be given a new heart. And in some of the verses I mentioned, there's also a new covenant coming with that. Okay, sounds very good. So, knowing all of this, let's look again at the start of this Ezra and Nehemiah book. This is Ezra 1, 1-4. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of King Cyrus of Persia to make a proclamation throughout the realm and also put it in writing. This is what the king of Persia said. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you who may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. And in any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold and goods and livestock and with freewill offerings for the temple of the God of Jerusalem. There's quite a bit to unpack there. So in the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, extra points for anyone who can tell me why Cyrus in particular is quite unique or why it's quite important that he's there. Okay. Pardon? Not quite. Is because King Cyrus, he was the Persian king that rode into Babylon and took the throne over the empire. So right there's a little nod to the promise about Babylon being conquered. The biblical author then is drawing our attention directly to Jeremiah. In order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of King Cyrus of Persia. So immediately as we're kicking off, we're seeing God is fulfilling his prophetic word. And this is why you have to know a bit about the backstory. You're supposed to look at these stories through this lens of their words, and this is God fulfilling them. And notice that it's always, in each of the examples of the leaders, it always starts with God prompting something, or God's favor being on someone, or God moving somebody's heart. It's always him that starts it. So moving on. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem and Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. See, they're not even having to fight for it. The king themselves is telling you, go and do this thing. Go do this thing that God's told you to do. And any locality where survivors may now be living, the people are to provide them with silver and gold and with goods and livestock and with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. Cha-ching. But why is that in particular significant? Because it reflects the plunder of the Egyptians in the Exodus story. There's a couple examples of that. Just one of them, Exodus 3, 21-22. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards you, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Skipping ahead a wee bit at the end of Ezra 6, it all kind of culminates with them celebrating Passover, just like the Israelites did when they left Egypt. So what would you be thinking if you were living in this time, right? Forgetting everything else you know, with these sort of these words spoken to you, and now you see that everything's moving. If you were one of the people who was going there, just like your ancestors who were leaving Egypt, you're now leaving Babylon, what would you be thinking? What would be on your mind? What would be in your heart? You might start to think of yourself and your life as you are part of a bigger biblical narrative. There's a bigger story going on here. We're moving into a new chapter, and you're going to be part of it. And it could be this. Anyone else get a fright? I did. Okay, so it could be that. It could be this. This could be the time of great fulfillment. This could be the time when God's going to fulfill all His promises, right? Could be, yeah. So as we move forward through the rest of the sermon and through the rest of the series, I want you to try and keep in mind, and we'll get it up on the screen for next week, I want you to try and keep in mind the prophetic promises that are behind all of this. The promise to rebuild, to return, that all the nations will come, this messianic king, and this new heart. Cool. So, let's get into the work of of our first leader in the Ezra story, which is Zerubbabel, which means planted in Babylon. So we're going to skip ahead to chapter 3 here, and Ezra leads the people in rebuilding the altar and starting up the sacrificial system based on the law of Moses. They offer burnt offerings and they celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Festival of Tabernacles, rather. They build the temple again, and many celebrate, and many others who are of the slightly older generation, they weep, and they weep out loud. There's a real mixed reaction to what's going on here. And what they're doing, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, they're rebuilding or reestablishing their identity as a people after exile. They are, finally, all the people are back together again, and now they're trying to figure out who they are. They're rooting themselves in the traditions and laws of their people and their God. And for some people, it's amazing, and for others, they're saying this isn't what it used to be. And it's the older generation that are saying that, maybe. And maybe they're just stuck in the past. Or do they know that something's missing? As we move on to chapter 4, we meet opposition. Again, this is a recurring theme throughout the books. When every leader moves forward, there's some kind of opposition that comes. I'm just going to read this part for you from Ezra 4. Just pay attention to the language and the order it appears in. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build because, like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commands us." Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. I don't want to talk about the opposition too much because that's more something I think Andy will cover in his next week. You'll notice throughout the sermon I'm going to keep putting things on Andy to deal with for next week as punishment for all of this. But I just want to look at that passage again and ask the question, why does the narrator describe these guys as the enemies and then they immediately say, "We want to help you build the temple because we're seeking the same God"? A little odd. Is it because they knew at the time their motives aren't as innocent as they seem? Or is it more, this is the story of how they became the enemies through that initial rejection? Food for thought. But I think at the core of what they're doing is because of their identity. They're trying to figure out who they are and they're trying to remain a distinct people. Speaking of which, we get to the end of Zerubbabel's time by chapter 6. And then chapter 7, around 60 years later, we meet Ezra. And Ezra is a teacher of the law. And he's supported by King Artaxerxes at the time to go and teach the Torah. And he's given everything he asks for because the hand of the Lord was on him. And he begins this spiritual rebuilding in the community. And then we get to Ezra 9. And we meet his opposition, which is very much an opposition towards what he perceives, I think, and some of the other leaders, as their cultural identity. So I'll just read 9. After these things had been done, the leaders came to me and said, "The people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites." I know, right? It's the Amorites and Ammonites and Amorites. Sorry. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them and the leaders and officials. They have led the way in this unfaithfulness. That holy race part, some translations will have holy people. Mine has holy race. And if that phrase makes you feel a little uncomfortable, I know how you feel. But I think it's probably a good translation, not because I agree with it, because it kind of illuminates something of the perspective or focus that Ezra might have had towards them as a group. Again, this is a story, that's something for another time. But again, in Ezra's mind, he is trying to figure out, how does the law of Moses apply to us now? How do we remain this distinct people set aside for God? And in this knowledge of marrying outside of Israel, his solution is that all the women and children that are not of the people of Israel are to be sent away. In that time and place, that's your dependents, sent off. It's an infamous story, and it's partly carried out. It's not fully enacted. It doesn't quite take root. And again, I'm not defending his actions, but I think, again, at the core of it, he's trying to figure out, how do we be God's people now after the exile? How do we take hold of our identity again? So they're taking extreme actions. So, at the end, Zerubbabel and Ezra, both released by a Persian king to go do the work they need to do, they both face opposition, and they both overcome it in ways that might make us uncomfortable. And there's both a kind of mixed results to their work. So, you've done it. You've sat through the prologue. Finally, we can get onto the story. Finally, we can go into Ezra 1. We can meet our hero at last. So, and again, I apologize in advance for any names that I'm about to butcher. So this is Nehemiah 1. The word of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 12th year, whilst I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." Nehemiah asks his brother, how are they doing, the Israelites that have went back? How are they faring? And he's telling them it's not good. They're vulnerable, and they're in a place of low esteem. And the walls are broken down, the gates have been burned with fire. And what's his response to this? It breaks him. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept for some days. I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Do you think this was everyone's response to hearing this? Would it have been yours? Probably wouldn't have been mine. To mourn and fast for days, maybe even weeks. I think we're seeing this is included here because we're seeing how God is moving him in an unusual way. It's really deeply impacting him. And then he goes on to this incredible prayer. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed your commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather you from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as my dwelling for my name. It kind of parallels a similar prayer in the start of Deuteronomy 30, if you're interested. So, continuing. They are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. What man? Oh, I was a cupbearer. I was a cupbearer to the king. Literally the last thing in the chapter. He just mentions this there as just a one-off sort of throwaway phrase. So Nehemiah was a cupbearer. Well, a cupbearer is a position of the royal staff. They literally hold the cup to prevent the king from being poisoned. It's a position of great trust by the king, and he's an Israelite in a foreign land and a cupbearer to the king. Just like Joseph, actually, now that I think about it. So, as he goes to work, in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins? The gates have been destroyed by fire. And the king said to me, What is it that you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Nehemiah didn't plan this. This wasn't part of some strategy. He heard the news of his city. It deeply impacted him. It deeply motivated him. It grieved him. And he quickly prays to God. And when the king inquires about why he's so sad, he quickly prays to God, and he tells him. And the king asks him, "Okay, what do you want?" And basically gives him what he asks for. There's a bit more. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? May I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the city, by the temple, and for the city walls, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me." That's very, very generous of the king. But again, God's hand was on Nehemiah. Politically speaking, there was probably a strategy in that. This was something that the Syrians did. They let the indigenous people return to their land, build their cities, build their temples, worship their God. That way they wouldn't complain so much when they taxed them. Just my spin on it. Okay, so I want to just power through a wee bit more, okay? So starting at 11, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on towards the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up to the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gates. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, with what the king had said to me. And then they replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. This whole story is Nehemiah offering us a realistic picture of what we might call divine providence or God's intervention. We're seeing all these different life events, all these different things just coming together. They're converging into one focus, one goal. From Hananiah's visit and report, Nehemiah's unusual emotional response, his season of prayer, the king noticing Nehemiah's emotions, his last-minute prayer, and him granting him this request, and he was also in this trusted position within the royal administration. It's all these right place, right time moments, isn't it? And Nehemiah doesn't force his plans on anybody. He doesn't try to justify them or convince anyone. He just goes out, he gathers information, and then he just tells the people, and he lets them come to their own conclusions. And they respond to him. And this kind of leadership style will spill over into how he deals with his opposition. And again, that's for Andy to look at next time. So, what do we think? So, we have these prophetic promises to return, to rebuild, to gather the nations, that a messianic king is going to come and a new heart is going to be given. And some of these have already been fulfilled. And now we're seeing Nehemiah stepping out, and we're seeing all these things just come into alignment for him. Things seem to be going really well for him. Could be that God's hand's on him. So what do we think? Do we think God's going to do something? Do we think God's going to fulfill more promises? Do you think this might be the time when everything's going to be fulfilled and this messianic king's just going to appear, forgetting what you know now? Yeah, it could be. It could be. And again, if you were following him or you were Nehemiah at this time, seeing all this just come into alignment, What would you be thinking? So, as we progress through the rest of the story, you've sat through the context now. It's done. We can now look at Nehemiah's story, and Andy will start us off with that next week, and then I'll sort of finish it the week after. So again, keep in mind the prophetic promises. Keep in mind what they must be thinking and feeling. So that's it. The stage is set. The orchestra is engaged. And let's see if Nehemiah can dance. Thank you very much.